In the early 1930s, in a quiet laboratory in California, a young doctor stood over what everyone else in the room would have called a corpse. The dog had been dead for several minutes. No pulse, no breathing, no response. By every accepted definition of the time, it was over. But the doctor disagreed. He adjusted a strange mechanical table, something between a stretcher and a pendulum, and gave a signal. The body began to move, tilting back and forth rhythmically, almost unnaturally. Assistants injected chemicals meant to keep the blood from clotting. Time stretched, minutes passed. Then something happened, a twitch, a breath, a movement that should not have been possible. The dog opened its eyes. News of the experiment spread quickly. Newspapers didn't know what to call it. Some used the word revival. Others chose something more provocative, resurrection. The man behind it all, a young physician named Robert E. Cornish, did not shy away from the attention. He made a claim no serious scientist was supposed to make. Death, he said, was not final. It was reversible. At a time when medicine still struggled to save patients from infections and basic trauma, Cornish was proposing something far more radical, that the boundary between life and death was not a wall, but a door, and with the right method, it could be opened. But there was a problem. The animals he brought back were not the same, and Cornish knew it. Still, he pushed forward, because if even a broken return was possible, then a complete one might be next. He began speaking openly about the next step, human trials. The idea sounded unthinkable, impossible, dangerous. And yet, in an era fascinated by scientific breakthroughs and unafraid of risk, there were those willing to listen. Even one man willing to volunteer. A convicted prisoner, facing execution, offered his body to science in exchange for a chance, any chance at life after death. For Cornish, this was the moment everything had been leading to. For everyone else, it was the moment the question became unavoidable. If you can bring a body back, what exactly are you bringing back with it? Long before anyone called him reckless, before newspapers turned his name into a curiosity or a warning, Robert E. Cornish was simply a prodigy. He was born in 1903 in California, into a family that expected excellence and got it. By the time most young men were still deciding what to do with their lives, Cornish had already chosen his battlefield, death itself. He entered college early, moved quickly, and by his early 20s had earned a PhD in chemistry. Not long after, he completed his medical degree. To his peers, he was brilliant. To his professors, promising. To himself, he was late. Because death, as he saw it, was not waiting. At University of California, Berkeley, Cornish worked as a researcher at a time when modern medicine was still finding its footing. Antibiotics were only just beginning to transform survival rates. Blood transfusions were improving. Surgery was becoming more precise. But there remained a hard limit, an invisible line that no one crossed. Once a patient died, medicine stopped. Cornish refused to accept that rule. To him, death was not a mystical event. It was mechanical, a sequence of failures. The heart stopped. Blood ceased to circulate. Oxygen no longer reached the brain. Cells began to die. But none of this, he believed, happened all at once. There was a window, brief, fragile but real, during which the body had not yet crossed an irreversible threshold. If that window existed, then death was not absolute. It was a process. And processes, Cornish believed, could be interrupted. This idea did not emerge from abstraction. It came from observation. In hospitals, patients sometimes lingered between life and death in ways that defied easy explanation. There were moments, rare, unpredictable, when someone appeared gone, only to show faint signs of return. A weak pulse, a shallow breath, enough to create doubt. For most physicians, those moments were anomalies. For Cornish, they were proof. He began to study what happened in the body immediately after death, not hours later, not during decomposition, but in those first critical minutes when, technically, everything had stopped, but not everything was lost. He focused on circulation. Without blood flow, oxygen vanished from the brain within minutes. Neurons began to fail. Damage accumulated rapidly. But what if circulation could be restored artificially? What if the heart didn't need to restart on its own? At least, not immediately. What if the body could be kept in motion long enough to buy time? The problem was deceptively simple. How do you move blood through a body without a heartbeat? Machines capable of doing that did not yet exist. There were no advanced life support systems, no heart-lung machines as we understand them today. The technology that modern medicine would one day take for granted simply wasn't there. So Cornish did something both ingenious and unsettling. He decided to use motion itself. If the heart could not pump blood, perhaps gravity could. By tilting the body back and forth, he theorized, it might be possible to force blood to circulate through the vessels, imperfectly, but enough to deliver oxygen where it was needed most. It was an idea that sounded almost absurd, until he built it. The device was simple in concept and strange in appearance. A mechanical table that could rock a body rhythmically, head down, then feet down, over and over again. It resembled a piece of exercise equipment more than a medical instrument. But to Cornish, it was something else entirely. It was a substitute for the heart. There was another problem. Blood, once circulation stopped, began to clot. Even if he could move it through the body, it might already be too thick, too obstructed to flow properly. So, Cornish introduced a second element into his method: anticoagulants, chemicals designed to prevent clotting and keep the blood in a usable state. Motion and chemistry. Together, he believed, they might be enough. His colleagues were not convinced. Some dismissed the idea outright. Others were more cautious, suggesting that even if circulation could be restored, the brain would already be too damaged to recover. The prevailing belief was clear. Once the brain was deprived of oxygen for more than a few minutes, the person was gone, regardless of what the rest of the body did. Cornish listened, and then he continued. Because to him, the question was not whether death could be reversed in theory. It was whether anyone had tried hard enough in practice. He was not reckless in the way critics would later describe him. He did not begin with human subjects. He began, as many researchers of his time did, with animals, dogs. They were chosen not out of cruelty, but out of convention. Dogs were commonly used in medical experiments in the early 20th century. Their physiology was considered close enough to humans to provide meaningful insight. What happened in a dog's body, researchers believed, could hint at what might happen in ours. Cornish approached the work methodically. First, he needed to define death in a controlled setting. He would induce cardiac arrest, stop the heart, and then measure how long the body remained in that ambiguous state before irreversible damage set in. Timing was everything. Too early, and the experiment proved nothing. Too late, and nothing could be recovered. Then came the intervention. The body would be placed on the rocking table. Anticoagulants would be administered. The motion would begin, back and forth, again and again, forcing blood to move through vessels that no longer had a natural pump. He watched for signs, a twitch, a breath. Anything that suggested the body was not entirely lost. What he was looking for was not just survival, it was return. In these early stages there were failures, many of them. Bodies that did not respond, systems that did not restart, silence that remained silence. But Cornish was not discouraged, because in science, especially at the edge of what is known, failure is not an end. It is data. Each attempt refined the next. Adjustments were made: timing, dosage, duration of motion. He documented everything. He observed patterns. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to change. The line between life and death, once considered absolute, started to blur. Not in theory, but on the table in front of him. By the mid-1930s, Cornish was no longer just asking whether death could be reversed. He was getting close to demonstrating it. And when that moment came, when something that had been dead began to move again, it would not just challenge medical understanding. It would force a far more unsettling question into the open. If the body can be brought back, what happens to the mind? By 1934, Robert E. Cornish had moved beyond theory. The question was no longer if death could be interrupted. It was how long after death the body could still be pulled back, and what would return when it did. In his laboratory, the experiments became more precise, more controlled, and more disturbing. Cornish began referring to his subjects by a name that was impossible to ignore: Lazarus. It was not subtle. It was not accidental. The reference to the biblical figure brought back from the dead was exactly the point. These were not resuscitations, he believed. They were reversals. The procedure followed a strict sequence. First, the animal, most often a dog, was anesthetized. Then, cardiac arrest was induced. The heart stopped. Breathing ceased. Circulation collapsed. By every clinical standard of the time, the animal was dead. And then Cornish waited. This was the critical variable. He did not act immediately. Instead, he allowed minutes to pass, long enough to simulate real death, but not so long that recovery would be impossible. He was searching for the edge, the exact moment when life tipped into irreversibility. No one knew where that line was. Cornish intended to find it. When the waiting period ended, the second phase began. The body was transferred onto the mechanical rocking table. Back and forth, head down, feet down, again. The motion was not gentle. It was deliberate, rhythmic, almost mechanical in its persistence. The goal was simple: force the blood to move. Without a heartbeat, the body had no engine. The table would become that engine. At the same time, anticoagulants were administered, most notably heparin, to prevent the blood from clotting inside the vessels. Without this step, even artificial circulation would fail, motion, and chemistry. It was a crude system by modern standards. But in the 1930s, it was something else entirely. It was unprecedented. At first, there was nothing. The body remained still, limbs unresponsive, no sign of life. Assistants watched in silence, some skeptical, some uneasy, all aware that what they were witnessing did not fit within accepted medicine. Cornish, however, watched differently. He was not looking for obvious signs. He was looking for the smallest deviation from death. A flicker, a tremor, a breath too shallow to be called breathing, but too real to ignore. And then, in some cases, it happened. A twitch in the muscles, a movement of the chest, a return so slight it could be dismissed, until it happened again. One of the most documented cases involved a series of dogs later referred to in reports as successful revivals. They did not simply regain circulation, they regained activity, but not fully, and not cleanly. The animals that returned did not behave as they had before. Their movements were uncoordinated, their responses delayed. Some appeared disoriented, unable to stand properly or control their bodies. Others showed signs that suggested neurological damage, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. They were alive. But something was missing. Cornish documented everything. He recorded the timing of death, the duration before intervention, the chemicals used, the length of rocking, the observable responses. To him, this was progress. Imperfect, incomplete, but real. Because for the first time he had evidence that a body declared dead could resume function. The implications were enormous. If circulation could be restored, if breathing could resume, if life could be restarted even partially, then death was no longer a fixed point. It was a threshold. But the scientific community was not celebrating. They were watching carefully. And what they saw raised as many concerns as it did possibilities. Because the question was shifting. It was no longer, can you bring a body back? It was becoming, should you? The results were difficult to interpret. Yes, some animals showed signs of recovery, but the neurological damage suggested that the brain, so sensitive to oxygen deprivation, did not survive the process intact. Even when the body functioned, the mind did not fully return. In medical terms, this was not a victory. It was a warning. Cornish, however, did not see it that way. To him, the damage was not proof of failure. It was proof of timing. He believed the problem was not whether the method worked, but when it was applied. If intervention came sooner, if circulation was restored faster, if the window between death and revival could be shortened, then perhaps the brain could be preserved. And if the brain could be preserved, then everything else would follow. He refined his process, adjusted the intervals, improved the chemical balance, modified the motion of the table. Each experiment brought him closer, not to perfection, but to consistency. And consistency in science is dangerous. Because once something works more than once, it stops being an anomaly. It becomes a method. By the mid-1930s, Cornish had something no one else could claim. Not a theory, not a hypothesis, but a repeatable procedure that, under specific conditions, could reverse certain aspects of death. He had crossed a line most scientists would not approach, and he had done it publicly. Newspapers began to take interest. The idea of bringing the dead back to life was too powerful to ignore. Reports simplified the details, amplified the results, and transformed a complex, controversial experiment into something far more dramatic. A miracle, or a nightmare, depending on who was reading. Cornish did not retreat from the attention. If anything, he leaned into it. Because in his mind, the experiments had already answered the most important question. Death could be interrupted. Now, there was only one question left. And it was the one everyone else was afraid to ask. If it worked on animals, why not try it on humans? By the mid-1930s, Robert E. Cornish had crossed a line that most scientists would never even approach. He had not cured death, but he had done something almost as unsettling. He had made it negotiable. The experiments on animals, his so-called Lazarus subjects, had already drawn attention across the United States. Newspapers alternated between fascination and alarm. Headlines spoke of revival, resurrection, and the possibility of defeating the final boundary of human existence. For the public, it was spectacle. For the scientific community, it was something else entirely, a problem. Because Cornish was no longer speaking in cautious, academic language. He was making a proposal. If death could be reversed in animals, even imperfectly, then the next logical step was obvious: human trials. At first, it sounded like theory. A provocation, perhaps. The kind of statement designed to attract attention, to push conversation beyond its limits. But Cornish was not provoking. He was preparing. He began to speak openly about the conditions under which such an experiment could be conducted. It would not be random. It would not be reckless. At least, not by his own definition. The subject, he argued, would need to be someone already condemned. Someone for whom death was certain. A prisoner sentenced to execution. In that context, Cornish believed, the ethical dilemma changed. If a man was going to die anyway, what was the harm in attempting to bring him back? To Cornish, it was not exploitation. It was opportunity. The proposal reached the public faster than anyone expected. And then, something even more unexpected happened. A volunteer appeared. The man was a convicted murderer, facing the death penalty in California. His name appeared in reports at the time, though later accounts would obscure or omit it. But his situation was clear. Execution was inevitable. But Cornish's experiment offered something else. Not freedom, not forgiveness, but a chance to pass through death and return. The terms, as reported, were stark. The prisoner would be executed, most likely by hanging or another method consistent with the sentence. His body would then be immediately transferred to Cornish's team. The resuscitation procedure would begin within minutes, using the same method that had been tested on animals: mechanical rocking, anticoagulants, forced circulation. If successful, the man would be revived. And then came the most unsettling question of all. What would happen next? There was no clear answer. Would he still be legally dead? Would his sentence still apply? Could a man executed by the state be executed again? The law had never faced such a scenario, because until that moment, no one had seriously believed it could happen. The story spread quickly. Newspapers seized on it. The idea of a condemned man volunteering for resurrection blurred the line between science and something far more existential. Editorials debated not just the ethics of the experiment, but the nature of death itself. Was it a fixed point? Or had Cornish exposed it as something reversible? But inside government offices in California, the reaction was far less philosophical. It was immediate. And it was negative. State authorities refused to allow the experiment. The reasons were not complicated. There were legal concerns. No framework existed to define the status of someone revived after execution. There were ethical concerns. No precedent for using a human subject in such a way. And there were practical concerns. No guarantee that what returned would resemble the person who had died. In fact, based on Cornish's own animal experiments, there was reason to believe it would not. The decision was final. No human trial would be permitted. For Cornish, it was more than a setback. It was a barrier placed directly in front of the one question he had spent years trying to answer. Because everything he had done, every experiment, every adjustment, every incremental success, had been leading to this moment. Animals had shown that the body could be restarted, but only a human subject could answer what truly mattered, whether the mind returned with it. Without that step, his work remained incomplete, provocative, disturbing, suggestive of something revolutionary, but incomplete. Cornish did not abandon the idea. He continued to argue that the experiment was not only possible, but necessary. That the only way to understand death was to confront it directly. That avoiding the question did not make it disappear. If anything, it made it more dangerous. But the world was changing. The late 1930s were not a time for philosophical experiments. Political tensions were rising. War was approaching. Scientific priorities were shifting toward more immediate concerns: injury, survival, battlefield medicine. There was less patience for theories that challenged the definition of death, and even less tolerance for experiments that might blur it completely. Without approval, without access to human subjects, Cornish's work reached a limit, not because he had failed, but because he had gone as far as he was allowed to go. And yet, the most unsettling part of his story was not what he did. It was what he almost did, because for a brief moment, in a laboratory in California, the idea had moved from impossible to nearly inevitable. A man was ready to die. A doctor was ready to bring him back. And the only thing that stopped it was the fear of what might return. By the time Robert E. Cornish began to refine his method, the question was no longer whether something could be brought back. It was what, exactly, was coming back. In his published reports and demonstrations, Cornish described cases he considered successful. Dogs that had been declared dead, no heartbeat, no respiration, showed signs of life after intervention. Circulation resumed. Breathing returned. Muscles responded. On paper, it looked like a breakthrough. But in the laboratory, the reality was harder to ignore. The animals did not recover cleanly. They did not stand up and walk away. They did not return to what they had been. Some could not stand at all. Others tried and failed, their legs unable to coordinate movement. Their bodies responded unevenly, as if signals from the brain were arriving too late, or not at all. Observers noted tremors, weakness, disorientation. In some cases, the animals appeared alert for brief moments, only to lapse into confusion again. They were alive, but not intact. The problem, as even Cornish acknowledged, was time. The brain is the most vulnerable organ in the body when oxygen is cut off. Within minutes of cardiac arrest, neurons begin to suffer irreversible damage. The longer the delay before circulation is restored, the more severe the injury. Cornish's method, rocking the body to force blood movement, was not immediate. Even in the best-case scenario, there was a gap, a silence between death and intervention. And in that silence, something critical was lost. What Cornish was observing was not just recovery. It was partial survival. In modern terms, the condition would be recognized as severe hypoxic brain injury. But in the 1930s, the language was less precise. Observers described what they saw: animals that moved, but not normally, that reacted, but inconsistently, that existed somewhere between responsiveness and absence. The body had restarted. The brain had not fully followed. This created a problem that was not just medical, but philosophical. Because if the heart beats, if the lungs function, if the body responds, is that life? Or is it something else? Cornish did not avoid this question, but he reframed it. To him, the damage was not proof that the method failed. It was evidence that the method needed to be applied faster, earlier, closer to the moment of death. If circulation could be restored before the brain crossed its own threshold, then the outcome, he believed, would be different, better, complete. It was a logical argument, and a dangerous one, because it shifted the goal. The issue was no longer whether the method worked in principle. It was whether it could be perfected in practice, and that perfection depended on something no experiment could fully control: timing at the edge of death. Some of Cornish's colleagues were willing to consider the possibility, but many were not. The results, as they saw them, raised a more immediate concern, not what might be possible in the future, but what was already happening in the present. Bodies were being revived, but minds were not returning with them. There were also practical limitations. The mechanical rocking table, while innovative, was crude. It could not replicate the precision of a natural heartbeat. Blood flow was uneven, oxygen delivery inconsistent. Even with anticoagulants, circulation was imperfect. Some tissues received enough to survive, others did not. And the brain, with its extreme sensitivity, paid the highest price. Reports of the experiments began to circulate more widely, and with them came a shift in tone. Where early coverage had leaned toward fascination, toward the idea of conquering death, later accounts became more cautious, more skeptical, some openly critical, because the image was no longer just a doctor bringing something back to life. It was a doctor bringing something back, damaged. Cornish continued his work. He documented improvements, adjustments in timing that appeared to reduce the severity of symptoms. Cases that suggested partial recovery could be stabilized. He argued that the results were evolving, that what seemed incomplete now might, with refinement, become viable. But the central problem remained visible and undeniable. What came back was not the same as what had died. For some observers, this was the moment the line became clear. Not between life and death, but between life and something that only resembled it. The implications for human trials were impossible to ignore. If a revived animal could lose coordination, awareness, or cognitive function, what would happen in a human subject? What would it mean to bring back a person whose body functioned, but whose mind had been irreversibly altered? Would that be survival? Or something closer to erasure? These were not abstract questions. They were the reason authorities hesitated. The reason permission for human experimentation was denied. Because whatever Cornish had discovered, it came with a cost. And that cost was not measured in heartbeats, but in what remained behind the eyes. Still, Cornish refused to see it as a failure, because from his perspective, the most important boundary had already been crossed. The body could return. And if the body could return, then, sooner or later, everything else might follow. But for those watching from the outside, the conclusion was already forming. Not all forms of life are the same, and some returns are not returns at all. By the late 1930s, the name Robert E. Cornish no longer carried the same sense of awe it once had. What had begun as a story of radical possibility, of a young scientist challenging the final boundary of human existence, was slowly turning into something far less comfortable. The fascination remained, but it had changed shape. It was no longer driven by hope. It was driven by doubt. At first, the shift was subtle. Scientific circles grew quieter around his work. Invitations became less frequent. Papers that might once have been discussed seriously were now met with hesitation, with cautious language that masked a deeper skepticism. Cornish had not been disproven in a clean, definitive way. That would have been easier. Instead, he existed in a space that made the scientific community uneasy. He had demonstrated something real, but not something controllable, not something safe. His results were impossible to ignore, but just as impossible to accept. Outside academia, the tone changed faster. Newspapers that had once described him as a pioneer began to reframe the narrative. The same experiments that had been called breakthroughs were now described as strange, unsettling, even grotesque. The phrase bringing the dead back to life no longer sounded like a promise. It sounded like a warning. Cornish did not help his own case. He continued to speak publicly, to defend his work, to insist that the limitations others focused on were temporary. He argued that the failures were not failures at all, but steps, necessary, predictable steps, on the path towards something larger. But the more he spoke, the more isolated he became. His confidence, once seen as brilliance, began to look like obsession. And obsession, in science, is rarely forgiven. The timing made everything worse. As the world moved toward war, priorities shifted. Medicine turned toward the urgent needs of survival: trauma care, infection control, battlefield injuries. There was less interest in speculative work that challenged the definition of death itself. Cornish's research did not fit into the new reality. It was too uncertain, too controversial, too far removed from immediate necessity. Funding became harder to secure. Institutional support weakened. The space he had once occupied, on the edge of accepted science, began to close. He was not formally expelled from the scientific world. There was no single moment of rejection, no dramatic announcement that ended his career. Instead, it happened gradually, quietly. The kind of disappearance that leaves no clear point of rupture, only a growing distance between a man and the field he once belonged to. He continued his work where he could, continued refining ideas, documenting observations, searching for a way forward without the backing he once had. But without broader acceptance, without the ability to test his methods at scale, especially on human subjects, his progress slowed. And in time, it stopped. The scientific community moved on. New technologies emerged. New approaches to resuscitation began to take shape, grounded in more controlled, measurable systems. Defibrillation, advanced cardiac life support, techniques that would eventually allow doctors to restart hearts, to stabilize patients who would once have been lost. These developments did not come from Cornish's work directly, but they occupied the same space he had tried to define. The difference was control. Where Cornish had forced the body back into motion, modern medicine learned how to guide it. Where his methods had been mechanical and approximate, newer techniques became precise, repeatable, safe enough to integrate into standard practice. And with that shift, his work began to look less like a foundation and more like a dead end. By the 1940s, his name appeared less frequently in serious discussion. When it did, it was often as a curiosity, a historical footnote, an example of how far science could go when driven by the wrong kind of certainty. The nuance, the fact that he had identified something real, something that would later be explored in more sophisticated ways, was largely lost. He had become a cautionary tale. But even that label did not fully capture what had happened, because Cornish had not been entirely wrong. He had recognized, before many others, that death was not a single moment, that there was a window, brief, unstable but real, during which intervention could make a difference, that the body did not shut down all at once, and that under certain conditions, some of its functions could be restored. What he lacked was not insight. It was precision and time. Time to develop better methods. Time to refine what he had started. Time that, for reasons both scientific and historical, he was never given. In the end, Cornish did not fade because his question was meaningless. He faded because it was too dangerous to pursue the way he had chosen to pursue it, and because the answers he offered came with consequences no one was ready to accept. He spent the rest of his life outside the center of the field he had once tried to redefine, his most controversial work behind him, his central idea still unresolved. Death, despite everything, remained undefeated, but the line he had tried to erase no longer looked as solid as it once had. Even as his reputation declined, even as his methods were abandoned, the question he had forced into the open did not disappear. It waited for someone else to ask it again, and this time to answer it differently. By the time Robert E. Cornish disappeared from serious scientific discussion, it seemed as if his work had reached a dead end. His methods were abandoned, his results questioned, and his name slowly reduced to a curiosity. A strange episode in the history of medicine when one man believed he could reverse death itself. But the idea he chased did not disappear with him. It moved forward, quietly, through other hands, under different names, using better tools. Medicine did not try to bring the dead back in the same way Cornish had. Instead, it began to understand something more precise and more powerful. Death was not a single moment. It was a process, and if that process could be interrupted early enough, it might never fully complete. This shift changed everything. Instead of attempting to reverse death after it had already taken hold, doctors focused on stopping it from progressing beyond a certain point. The emergence of cardiopulmonary resuscitation, CPR, was one of the first clear signs of this change. Instead of waiting for the body to fully shut down, intervention began immediately. The heart might stop, but hands could take over its function, compressing the chest, forcing blood to move, delivering oxygen just long enough to preserve the brain. It was no longer about resurrection. It was about buying time. And sometimes, time was enough. Defibrillation followed, adding another layer of control. A stopped heart was no longer final. With a precisely delivered electrical shock, chaotic rhythms could be corrected, and a heart that had fallen into silence could be forced back into motion. What had once been an irreversible event became, under the right conditions, temporary. The principle behind all of this was something Cornish had understood decades earlier, even if he could not fully implement it. Circulation was everything. Without it, the brain died. With it, even artificially maintained survival remained possible. The difference was that modern medicine could now control that circulation with far greater accuracy than a rocking table ever could. Then came technologies that would have seemed almost unimaginable in the 1930s. Machines capable of replacing the function of the heart and lungs entirely. Extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, ECMO, allowed blood to be drawn from the body, oxygenated outside of it, and returned in a continuous cycle. The body no longer needed to sustain itself in the traditional sense. It could be supported, maintained, held in a suspended state where life continued without its natural drivers. Under these conditions, patients could exist without a heartbeat of their own, without independent breathing, and yet still be considered alive, or at least not dead. The boundary had shifted. What once marked the end was now just another stage, one that could, in some cases, be reversed. Cases began to appear that would have sounded impossible in Cornish's time. Patients without pulse for several minutes were revived. Some recovered fully. Others did not. In rare situations, individuals exposed to extreme cold were brought back after even longer periods, their bodies preserved just enough to allow the brain to survive the absence of oxygen. The window Cornish had believed in, the narrow space between death and irreversibility, was real. It had always been there. Medicine had simply learned how to enter it more effectively, but the same limitation remained, unchanged from the moment Cornish first encountered it. The brain was still the weakest point in the system. It could not tolerate delay. It could not be restarted once a certain threshold had been crossed. And when it failed, everything else, no matter how well it functioned, lost its meaning. Not every patient brought back by modern techniques returned as they had been. Some suffered severe neurological damage. Others regained only fragments of consciousness. The body could be stabilized, supported, even sustained for extended periods. But the mind did not always follow. The same unsettling gap Cornish had observed in his laboratory, the space between biological function and something we recognize as a person, remained. At the same time, other scientists explored the limits of life from a different angle. In the Soviet Union, Vladimir Demikov conducted experiments that demonstrated how far biological systems could be manipulated and sustained. Organs could be transplanted, circulation rerouted, life extended beyond what had once seemed possible. These experiments did not solve the problem Cornish had faced, but they reinforced the same unsettling truth. Life was not as simple, or as unified, as it appeared. As science advanced, the definitions became more complicated. Clinical death no longer meant what it once had. A stopped heart was not the end. But brain death emerged as something far more final, a point beyond which recovery was no longer possible, regardless of what machines could maintain. The focus shifted from the body to the mind, from function to identity. And in that shift, Cornish's work began to look different. Not validated, not redeemed, but recontextualized. He had been working in the right direction, asking the right question, but with tools too crude to answer it. He had tried to force life back into a system that required precision he did not yet have. What he saw as partial success, others saw as failure. What he interpreted as progress, others recognized as damage. But he had identified something fundamental. Death was not a single instant. It was a sequence. And within that sequence, there was a point where intervention still mattered. Today, medicine operates within that space every day. Doctors bring patients back from states that would once have been considered final. Hearts are restarted. Circulation is restored. Bodies recover. But even now, even with all the technology available, the outcome is not guaranteed. Because the most important part of survival, the part that defines who someone is, remains fragile in a way no machine can fully protect. And that is where Cornish's story still lingers. Not in his methods, which have long been abandoned, but in the question he left behind. Because we have learned how to restart the body, we have learned how to delay death, to interrupt it, to push it back beyond the limits once thought absolute. But we still do not control what returns, and we still do not fully understand where the line truly is, not between life and death, but between being alive and being someone who has come back. Robert E. Cornish did not cure death, but he forced the world to see it differently. Today, we restart hearts, restore breathing, and bring people back from what once would have been the end. Yet the same limit remains where he first stalked Nulsa with it, the brain. The body can return, but the person does not always follow. And no machine can guarantee that what comes back is complete. Medicine has learned to delay death, to interrupt it, even to reverse parts of it for a time. But it still cannot control the moment when life becomes something else. And that is the question he left behind, the one we still cannot answer. If you can bring someone back, how much of them has to remain for it to still be called life?